Brian, and welcome to another episode of Next Gen Equipping, where our passion is to equip youth leaders to give their faith away through helpful online resources. I think you'll enjoy today's episode. It is on PTSD, what it is, and why it matters for youth ministers. And if you find it helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. So, today's episode is on PTSD, what it is, and why it matters. Let's begin by understanding the term. Here's a definition that post-traumatic stress disorder is a clinically diagnosed mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. It is different from PTS, which is just post-traumatic stress, in both degree and severity. PTS is simply the body's normal flight or fight response to a traumatic event. There's four symptoms that people who have PTSD will exhibit. One is intrusive memories, maybe in the form of nightmares or flashbacks to the event that can be very, very upsetting. Another symptom is avoidance, that naturally, and this is so understandable, that if somebody had something awful happen to them, they would prefer not to think about it, much less talk about it. They may even avoid going to places or doing activities or visiting with people that would remind them of that traumatic event, which is so understandable. The third symptom is negative changes in thinking or mood, maybe a sense of hopelessness, maybe memory problems, perhaps some negative thoughts about oneself or about other people in the world. There might be a lack of interest in activities that someone once enjoyed, or there could just be emotionally numb. They might feel emotionally numb, again, which would be understandable. The fourth type of symptom is changes in physical or emotional distress. So this might mean that someone is easily startled or frightened. They may have trouble sleeping or concentrating, and they may even be dealing with an overwhelming sense of guilt or shame. So let's take a second and explore, what is it that causes PTSD in the first place? Well, doctors aren't sure why some people get this and others don't. And as with most mental health problems, PTSD is usually caused by a very complex mix of the following four causes. One could be simply just stressful experiences, and it could include the amount and the severity of the trauma that's been inflicted on somebody. A second contributing factor might be an inherited mental health risks, right? Such as a family history of anxiety and depression. A third cause is that would be inherited features of someone's personality, right? It's what we call someone's temperament, And the fourth way is just the way our brains regulate the chemicals and hormones in response to a stressful situation. And so everyone's different. And some people are going to deal with PTSD and others aren't, all because of this complex set of causes that we just talked about here. Why is it that we hear PTSD being talked about more today than at least when I was growing up? And so there's a couple reasons for it. One, researchers are paying much closer attention to it. A second reason is that America is in the longest sustained conflict in the history of our nation, that there are changes in the nature of combat exposure in war that we need to take into consideration. What do I mean by this? Well, here's one example. Many soldiers that are wounded in Afghanistan or Iraq who would have died in prior wars now survive, right? Maybe you've heard of something called the golden hour, that when a soldier is injured in the battlefield, if his fellow soldiers can get him into a medical clinic or facility within 1 hour of the injury, the likelihood of him surviving greatly increases, right? So we have more soldiers that are dealing with wounds, physical wounds and battle injuries on the field that are now surviving when in years past they may have passed away from that same injury. We are also experiencing improvements in physical and logistical abilities to support combat that in many cases exceed a soldier's psychological ability to endure it. Now that's a mouthful, and I want to share a quote with you. This comes from a book I read recently called Black Hearts, and the quote that I want to share with you is a rather lengthy one, but it is so good that I want to share it with you. You may or may not remember, but back in 2006, there was a horrific crime committed by our U.S. soldiers against an Iraqi family. And they broke into this girl's house one night. They murdered her mother, father, and siblings. And then a couple of soldiers proceeded to rape a young 14-year-old girl and then cover up their evidence by burning her body. It was horrific, absolute terrible thing that happened. And Jim looks at how could this have possibly happened? What were the events that led up to this terrible, terrible crime? So take a listen to what he has to say, and I think you'll find it particularly relevant to our discussion on PTSD.
The debilitating effects of warfare have likely been known to humankind since warfare existed, at least since Homer described Achilles' rampage and desecration of Hector in the Iliad. But scientists have been studying the topic in earnest only since World War II. And that work, though constantly growing and being revised, is conclusive on several major points. Primary among them, a soldier can endure combat for only so long before he begins to break down. In The Face of Battle, military historian John Keegan wrote that early studies concluded that a soldier reached his peak of effectiveness in the first 90 days of combat, and after that his efficiency began to fall off, and that he became steadily less valuable thereafter until he was completely useless. It is tempting to contrast the great battles of Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge and even the Tet Offensive, massive waves of tens of thousands of soldiers clashing against one another as gunfire rained down for days and thousands of men died, with Bravo companies fight and say the two don't even compare. And that is true in certain respects. Bravo faced no force-on-force battles that lasted more than a few hours, and these were rarely larger than a squad fighting a handful of insurgents. But to then conclude that Bravo's struggles were somehow less significant or more bearable does a disservice to the way that warfare has changed in the last few decades, and glosses over the psychological effects, still largely uncharted, that these changes have wrought. During World War II, units would be thrown into major battles that could last a day, a week, perhaps a month or even two, but then they would be withdrawn from the front lines for weeks, sometimes for several months before being sent into battle again. American policy during World War II was to never leave troops on the front lines longer than 80 days. The men of Bravo stayed in a combat zone, went outside the wire, onto the front lines, every single day for 11 months straight. In the case of the TCPs, they lived outside the wire 24 hours a day, and they experienced some form of enemy contact almost every single day. Deployments where every day is a combat day are a fairly new phenomenon in the U.S. Army. As former lieutenant colonel and psychological researcher Dave Grossman writes in his 1996 book, On Killing, spending months of continuous, emphasis his, exposure to the stresses of combat is a phenomenon found only on the battlefields of this century. It is only in this century that our physical and logistical capability to support combat has completely outstripped our psychological capacity to endure it.
Wow, that is such a powerful quote. And I know it's kind of long and I apologize for that, but it's just so good because it helps to explain the changing nature of combat exposure in war in the 21st century. It is very different than, say, in World War II. There's a third reason that I want to add as to why PTSD is getting more attention, and that is that emotional health issues are more prevalent today, largely due to the increase in traumatic events in someone's life, coupled with diminishing support networks. So that's a little bit of what PTSD is, and now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about why it's important for youth ministers. And I need to just get into this and share this a little bit because here's a fundamental operating assumption that I have about my work in doing work with military families and military students. And that is this, that the military is a subset of the larger civilian population. Therefore, trends occurring within the military are worth paying attention to because they are indicative of trends occurring in the larger civilian sector. There's a second assumption that I factor into this, and that is PTSD and depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues within the military are at a slightly elevated level compared to the general civilian population because military personnel and their families experience higher than normal levels of stress and traumatic events. I like to think of it as a pressure cooker, that Our military families deal with, and military kids, they deal with all the same struggles that regular adolescents their age are going to deal with. But then they have the added challenges of moving every couple years. They're, in some cases, they move overseas. And when you're overseas, you're dealing with different culture, different customs, different currency. And it just makes everything a little bit harder. And this is not to mention the reality of deployment that a young person has to process. Is my mom or dad going to be the same as when they left, right? And even if they don't come back with the physical injury, they might have sustained a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, or maybe are dealing now with emotional issues that are affecting the normal family dynamics as before when that active duty service member deployed. So they're in a pressure cooker, and so they're going to experience the stress a little bit more intensely than just a normal civilian population. So let me just give you a little bit of a forecast, all right? I've heard somebody once say that you're either in a storm right now, or you're coming out of a storm, or you're going back into a storm. Well, let me share with you this little graphic that I put together. So here's a storm, and let me introduce you to our friend George, okay? Here's George. And George is having a great season in life, right? The sun is out, the sun is shining, things are going well for George. And George may be thinking, man, life is great. But little does George know that he is about ready to walk into a storm. And that storm comes, and we are affected. It's like that pressure cooker, and everything is kind of compressing in on itself. Well, eventually, George is going to work himself out of the storm. That those storms hopefully won't last forever. They're going to go away, that a new season is coming, and there's going to be a little bit of a reprieve. But here's the kicker, that as we work through those storms of life, maybe it's a family member who's struggling with mental health issues, maybe it's a death in the family, maybe it's something more traumatic like a suicide, or somebody who's an alcoholic and you're just going through a difficult time, or a family that just is under enormous financial stress and is just getting pummeled by one like financial disaster after another. The hope is that if our friend George, if he works through that situation well, he's going to come out a little bit different on the other end. And so he's got a little top hat now. George is different, and he's going to be a little bit more prepared for when that next storm comes in his life. This is the resiliency life cycle that I've just described here. And the time to prepare for a storm is not when you're in the storm. The time to prepare is as you're in that nice sunny day and things are going well. That's the time to prepare for the coming storm that will happen. So what implications does this have then for youth workers? Because I think there's something significant. Even if you're just working with civilian teens, you're just watching this video because you're interested in it, it has implications for youth workers, whether you're working with military kids or civilians. The Army has 5 pillars of resiliency that I want to refer to. So what are those 5 pillars? The first pillar is this, the social pillar. It's our ability, our friendship networks, and whether or not we have good friends or bad friends that encourage us to make good choices or maybe bad choices. The second pillar is our family. That if we have a healthy, functional family, that can be a tremendous source of strength for somebody who's in the middle of a storm. The third pillar is an emotional pillar. And if somebody has a strong, robust emotional wherewithal, then they're going to be a little bit more prepared and equipped to deal with difficult times. The fourth pillar is the physical pillar. It's how well we maintain a good physical health. And it's amazing what a difference a good diet can make, what a good physical routine workouts can make, a good diet and good sleep. All of that can be a contributing factor into this resiliency life cycle and how well we prepare for those storms. And the fifth pillar, of course, is the spiritual pillar, that God made us to be spiritual beings, and we cannot ignore that part of who we are. And so those big questions in life, like who is God and what is he like, and what happened to this world? Why do we see all the pain and evil and suffering that we do? And how is God going to fix it anyway? And how is it going to be made right? How is all the wrongs going to be made right? And all the injustice made right again that we see in our world? And what happens after we die? You know, all of those are super important questions that if we had the big questions answered in life, then it can help us deal with some of those storms that are going to come as we journey through life. My wife and I, we put together a resiliency workshop for military teens here in Omaha. And here's just a little picture of something we did. These two basketballs here are actually have different, they're inflated differently, right? So that when you drop one basketball, it doesn't bounce at all. It just kind of, it hits the ground and stops. The other basketball is going to continue to bounce. And the idea is that we need to put air into our basketball when times are good so that when hard times come, we can bounce back from traumatic events. And then we use PVC pipe to help reinforce for our teens this idea of the 5 pillars of resiliency from the Army. And it just was a tremendous exercise that we walked through with these kids. There's some research I want to refer to about multiple safety nets. This is an article, some research I read while I was in school, and I just found it tremendously helpful. But there is research out there, and this is kind of like common sense, but it's always encouraging when there's good research to back up what we intuitively know to be true. And that is, they found that there are when a young person has multiple safety nets or positive factors in their life, it helps to mitigate serious trauma, all right? And I think that's encouraging because one, when we have multiple safety nets, in other words, when those 5 pillars in our life are strong, then it's going to help to reduce the adverse effects of traumatic events. And you know what? This may even help explain why some people will deal with the same traumatic event very, very differently, because those people may have multiple safety nets and they're able to deal with that trauma in a healthy way, and they're able to work through it in a healthy way. And the second thing is this, is that when we have multiple safety nets, it increases our ability to bounce back following a traumatic event. It's what we talked about. It's the resiliency life cycle. So we've talked about a lot of things in this episode so far. Let's try to pull it together a little bit. First thing I want us to review and remember is that PTSD and other emotional issues are real, and they are here to stay for the foreseeable future. When I look at Generation Z, the generation that we're reaching out to right now, they are dealing with suicide ideation, suicide, anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues at a rate that we haven't seen in a long time. And I think one of the contributing factors for that is they are dealing with more traumatic events, and they have fewer support networks in order to help get them through that. And that's what we talked about right here, that traumatic events in the life of a young person are only increasing, while at the same time the support networks available to them help get them through the storms, they are diminishing. Therefore, anything we do to strengthen the 5 pillars of resiliency is helpful, even if we can't see or measure the immediate results. I don't know about you, but sometimes in youth ministry, especially in military youth ministry, when kids move every 2 to 3 years, you don't often get to see the impact that you can make in a young person's life. But I just want us to be encouraged that anything we can do to strengthen their 5 pillars really is powerful and helpful to get them through it. So, questions for application. This is where the rubber meets the road, where we get down to brass tacks. The first question is this: how do you see teens? Do you see teens as holistic persons, or do you tend to minister to their spiritual needs only? I want to caution us to not get caught in this trap of only trying to address the spiritual aspect of who we are. God created us to be total persons. We have emotions, we have a personality, we have a spirit, we have a body, we have a family that He put us in. And if we ignore those other elements that are in a young person's life, then we're not serving them the best way that we can. So how do you see teens? Do you see them as holistic persons? Maybe you need to have a little bit more of a robust anthropology, an understanding of what it means to be human. Second question: how could you tweak your current annual program plan so that it intentionally strengthens every pillar of resiliency in the life of a teen? And you know what? All of us who are doing good work in youth ministry, we already know what we're going to be doing, right? We have an idea of the events that are coming down the pipeline. And maybe we could just make a 2 millimeter shift. And if we could just shift a little bit and be a little bit more intentional about how we communicate the 5 pillars of resiliency, then it could make a big difference in the life of a young person. And the third application is more for personal reflection. Are there pillars in your own life that need attention? Honest confession here. Earlier this year, I found myself in a bad place, all right? And I found myself struggling with depression that I just couldn't seem to get out of. And anxiety was big, and I was having a difficult season. So I reached out to a counselor. I recognized that my emotional pillar wasn't as strong as it could be. And I reached out for help, and it was humbling to do so, but it was so good because I'm in a much better place right now. And I'm so thankful for the help that my counselor provided. So there it is, PTSD. What is it and why it matters for youth ministers? I hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, please like, share, or subscribe. I would be honored if you would do so. Thanks so much for your time. Take care and God bless.